Welcome to the Hong Kong On Screen podcast, brought to you by Hong Kong On Screen, a Los Angeles-based non-profit organization promoting films and culture of Hong Kong.
Hello, welcome to the Hong Kong On Screen podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Justin, and with me is my co-host, Dr. Aubrey Tan.
Hi everyone, I'm Aubrey. Please call me Aubrey. Nice to meet you all. I am from Hong Kong and I now live in Orange County, California, and I teach film and television here.
And I am not a film professor like Aubrey. I'm actually only a student. I'm finishing a master's in film and TV production in Los Angeles, California, and I'm also from Hong Kong. So the Hong Kong On Screen podcast is brought to you by Hong Kong On Screen, which is a newly formed nonprofit organization based in Los Angeles, California, that aims to promote and preserve Hong Kong culture, especially our cinema, to the greater Los Angeles area, but also to a worldwide English-speaking audience. We regularly host screenings and other programs and activities that aim to preserve our voice of freedom and our local culture, especially our cinema. One of our latest programs is the podcast that you're currently listening to, which aims to be the first English-speaking podcast that is exclusively about Hong Kong cinema. It also acts as a space for us to discuss in detail our cinema, some of our movies, our culture, and our history. It also acts as a companion program to our screenings because this first episode that you're currently listening to is going to be about Ann Hui, whose latest film, Love After Love, Dayat Lo Hung, we are going to be screening on July 6th in the USC School of Cinematic Arts. So hopefully this podcast can give you more context and understanding and information about Ann Hui and her work and her life, etc. So Aubrey, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about Ann Hui?
Well, so Ann Hui was actually born to a Japanese mother and a Chinese father in Angshan in China in 1947.
I believe she was born in Manchuria, which is the northeast region of China that Japan occupied during the Second World War.
So she then moved to Macau and then to Hong Kong at the age of 5. So she pretty much grew up in Hong Kong. And then after graduating in the English and Comparative Literature department from Hong Kong University, which coincidentally I also studied at, she studied filmmaking at the London International Film School. And then she returned to Hong Kong in 1975, and then she joined TVB. And then she learned, filmmaking and television and filmmaking. And then she produced serials and documentaries. She also worked for RTHK at one point, which led to the Vietnam Trilogy, which we'll cover later. So before making her own movies, she worked as an assistant to other filmmakers. And this is how she started. Yeah.
Right. I would also like to add two things. The first is actually how her name is pronounced. She has one of the most difficult names to pronounce in all of Hong Kong cinema. Her last name is actually pronounced Hui from her Cantonese name Hui Onwa, and it's not Hui or Xu or anything like that. The second is that she's actually the most awarded director in the history of the Hong Kong Film Awards. She has 6 Best Director trophies, which is double the number of Johnny To and Wong Kar-wai and other more famous contemporaries. So she is one of the most prominent and respected directors in all of Hong Kong cinema, despite the lack of recognition and fame in the West. She is on the Mount Rushmore of Hong Kong cinema. So Aubrey, so we know Ann Hui rose to prominence during the Hong Kong New Wave. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the Hong Kong New Wave was and kind of what exactly it was?
Yeah, so Ann Hui actually traverses different periods of the Hong Kong New Wave cinema, and this is why today we're going to talk about one of her earlier works, 1982 film Boat People, and next week we're going to do the second wave of Hong Kong New Wave. So let me just go over a little bit about the history of Hong Kong during that time. So as we all know, Hong Kong experienced 157 years of British colonization. And in the 60s, primarily, we had a lot of Hong Kong commercial cinema, a lot of martial arts cinema. In the 50s, a lot of opera cinema, and then some other comedies and leftist films and drama and musicals, all of those commercial genres. And then in the 70s, Hong Kong experienced a very ideal growth of its economy, and also its TV industry was booming at the time. So the TV industry actually provided a lot of new film talent for the film industry. And the booming economy also provided a lot of new film investors from other sectors, such as real estate, fast food, like I'm sure that you've heard of Daigalog, and also we have big press companies like Dongfang Yatbo, and all those companies also were doing really well. So we had a lot of new investors who were interested in the film industry. And the 70s, as we all know, is also a time of change. It was also when the discussion of Hong Kong's handover started, because if you remember, in 1984, we had the Sino-British Declaration. So in the early 80s or even late 70s, Hong Kong people had already started talking about, the prospects of returning to the PRC and all that. And also in 1976, it was the end of the Cultural Revolution. So the PRC owned studios, film studios, and theaters in Hong Kong, they had more freedom to fund Hong Kong productions, and they were also open to collaborating with other foreign film companies. So, for instance, for the fundings from the PRC owned studios, we had Phoenix, which made four of the Hong Kong New Wave director Alan Fong's films, including Father and Son, Fu Jiteng, sorry. And then also Bluebird films from the PRC also made Boat People. It was run by the actress Xia Meng. So, we had a lot of, exciting energy and sources of funding and all that. So, and at the time, Hong Kong people also watched a lot of films. People always loved cinema. So it is in this situation that in the late 1970s that we had Hong Kong New Wave. So the name Hong Kong New Wave, apparently a lot of you would probably have expected. It came from the 1958 to 1962 French New Wave movement. So it was inspired by French New Wave. So in 1978, we had a film magazine at the time called Close Up, Dai Dak Se, which later became the Ning Shuang Zhao City Entertainment Magazine. So in the 1978, in August, that was the first time that one of the articles called the new type of Hong Kong cinema that explored different styles and did different things as Hong Kong New Wave. So the first Hong Kong New Wave, historians had different opinions about the periodic divisions, but primarily, at least for myself, I'm going to cut the first Hong Kong New Wave up until the 1983. So from late 1970s to 1983, we saw prominent, very talented new directors, including Ann Hui, Choi Hak, Patrick Lam, Alan Fong, all these directors, a lot of them coming from the TV industry, emerging to make exciting new films. And then after 1984 to the late 1990s, we had a different generation. Of course, the first wave directors continue to make films, but we also see a slight shift of the talent. So we then later saw Mabel Chong, Clara Law, Stanley Kwong, and of course, our beloved Wong Kar-wai in the second new wave. So this is the periodic division.
Right. So regarding this Hong Kong New Wave, Aubrey, can you tell us a little bit about kind of what were the predominant styles of filmmaking back then? What were the relevant subject matters and methods of production? And who were the major figures and what were their major films?
Yeah, it's really exciting. So there are different topics and different styles and a wide variety of genres that this movement produced. So it actually pioneered by Leung Po Chi in 1976 with the film Jumping Ash, Till Fui. And then after Jumping Ash, then we saw other also very important and different films showcasing different styles. So for instance, Jumping Ash is a film using real policemen to play policemen characters. Jumping Ash was funded by a businessman, Jimmy Ip, who ran a fashion brand at the time called Bang Bang. He also would use film to sell his other businesses like instant noodles, fashion, and all those things. So we see a tie in culture just like blockbuster Hollywood at the same time. Jumping Ash is more like a realist film, but sometimes you would also see some sort of like genre merging or mashup, like Choi Hak's 1979 film The Butterfly Murders, Deep Bean. It's sort of a combination of martial arts film and sci-fi. And then Ann Hui, we see a trend that Ann Hui is always interested in more realist portrayal of social issues. So her 1979 film, The Secret,
楓葉
Phone Gip, yeah, right. So that was actually about a 1970s double murder case about a teacher and his fiance. So the lovers, young lovers at the time, were tortured and killed by a mentally ill man. And then later the man got an insanity defense. So she was interested in madness. And I feel that, she has always been, interested, madness. And maybe this will even take us all the way to Night and Fork much, much later. And another director, Dennis Yu, he's also interested in, kind of like delirium madness in Hong Kong society. So he made The Beast, San Gao. So it's actually quite similar, I mean, in a way about this imaginary of the countryside of Hong Kong. So San Gao, The Beast, was also about a bunch of kind of like social outcasts or criminals, and they rape and murder a young girl, and yeah, so like that. And then for some other realist, also I would say more leftist director like Alan Fong Yoping, he also made Father and Son in 1981 to tackle the kind of like maybe patriarchal working class family culture in which sons are always valued and daughters are kind of like devalued. This kind of like working class or lower middle class film, I would see also, I even see other directors of his generation and also from other generations being influenced, such as that actually remind me of The Simple Life to the Ann Hui's 2011 film, and also Still Hillman, a more recent film, Oliver Chang's from 2018. So all these kind of family stories about public housing and poor people hoping to make it big with, or poor people coming to terms with life and things like that. But for more stylistic invention, we also see something so aesthetically innovative, such as The House of Lute from 1980, directed by Lao Xinghan, your Kam. So House of Lute it actually reminds me of Zhang Yimou's 知道 from 10 years later. So it is also about kind of like repressed sexuality. So House of Lute is very minimalistic. It's extremely aesthetically pleasing. It uses a lot of flute music to tell a story. It has minimal dialogue. It's very slow. Yeah, it's a good watch.
Right. So a lot of what you described, and also Anne Hui, is kind of part of this lineage of Hong Kong cinema that is kind of a little underlooked. That is, more like a social realist drama than the kind of cult genre films that a lot of audiences might associate Hong Kong cinema with.
Yeah, I mean, I would actually group Anne Hui as compared with her contemporaries more on the leftist side, because, like you said, both people was funded by China's state-owned company Bluebird. So there's that, and also at the time, we actually saw great success with both people. We also saw great success among other works funded by more commercial companies such as Golden Harvest. So before Golden Harvest came to success, the dominant company was Run Run Shaw in the 60s. And then so Run Run Shaw was monopolizing the market at the time. And then Golden Harvest later recruited new talent from the TV industry. And then, the game changed. So I would say that Hong Kong New Wave is a product of social changes in China and also Hong Kong's economic changes. Like we said, there's good economic growth. So businessmen were looking to co-sell other products with film at the same time. They would also, look not just to fund productions, but also to rent theaters so that they could, sell other things, in the same areas, such as restaurant premises or other things. And then we also see collaborations with overseas studios, such as with studios from Japan and the UK, like the Hammer Films in the UK for overseas exhibition. So it was a very exciting moment that Hong Kong films were able to sell and make money.
This kind of nicely leads into Boat People, which is one of her first few films, her fourth feature film, I believe. And as you said, part of her informal Vietnam trilogy, which started actually initially, the first entry of this informal trilogy is an episode of a TV show she made for Radio Television Hong Kong, which is our public broadcaster, kind of like BBC. And I believe it was called Loi Ha. I'm not sure what the title in English is. And that was kind of like a 45-minute short film, and during which she collected a lot of oral histories and interviews from Vietnamese refugees. The background being after the Vietnam War, a lot of Vietnamese refugees went on boats to escape the new Vietnamese regime, and many of them escaped to Hong Kong. So at that time, there were a lot of Vietnamese refugees arriving into Hong Kong. And Ann Hui did a lot of interviews with them. She said more than 100, and she kind of compiled these into source materials for Loi Ha, which is the TV's episode I was talking about. And after this, she continued using that material to make two more films: The Story of Woo Viet, 户越的故事, and Boat People, 投奔怒海, which is our focus today. So Boat People was officially released in 1982, but like Aubrey said, the genesis of the film was because Xia Meng, which is one of the Chinese producers Aubrey talked about, contacted Ann Hui and asked if she was interested in making a movie about boat people. And she said yes. And then after kind of 2 years of fixing the script many times, they arrived at the final version, which is currently about this Japanese photographer played by George Lam, a Hong Kong actor, who is hired by the new Vietnamese regime as a photographer to document children in Vietnam. As kind of like a propaganda photographer. And then he goes there, and then he starts seeing the dark underbelly, the dark side of Vietnam. So, and then instead he refocused his subject on the poor people living there. And then a bunch of stuff happens, we meet more refugees and they try to escape, and things get pretty horrific as a result. Boat People actually caused a lot of controversy when it came out and then when it was made, because I believe it's one of the first Hong Kong films to be partially funded by mainland China. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. And that was obviously a huge kind of problem at that time because, firstly, Hong Kong was not part of China back then. And because the PRC back then was still the communist regime, obviously, that created a lot of political tension overseas. For example, back then, Taiwan, which was a very important and lucrative market for Hong Kong films, they were under the Republic of China government and they were the anti-communists. So making this film by Ann Hui and her cast and crew, they were all risking their careers in Taiwan and they would face filmmaking bans in Taiwan.
Originally, both people wanted to cast Zhao Yunfat, Chow Yun-fat, to play Andy Lau's role, To Min, but Chow doesn't want to risk his market in Taiwan. He doesn't want to lose it, so he doesn't want to do it. So then later they cast Andy Lau to play that role.
Right. Another thing was when Boat People went to the Cannes Film Festival, it was originally slated to be in competition, but because of the PRC funding, the political background, the potential propaganda elements of the film, it was removed from the competition and it was shown as a surprise film out of competition. At that time, when the movie was made, China just ended a war with Vietnam, which is why China kind of funded the production of this movie, and it was seen as potentially anti-Vietnamese propaganda.
Yeah, it's very interesting when you talk about it because, like, so from China's perspective, is to make a film to show the harsh reality of Vietnamese communism, right? But
Hmm.
for the audience and critics at the time in Hong Kong, some people saw the film as Ann Hui's allegory. You know,
Hmm.
she denied that it was an allegory at all, but then some people saw it like a
Yeah,
metaphor of Hong Kong's
yeah.
future.
And I think if we watch it today, which I did, and it becomes very clear that it is, Vietnam in both people is the future Hong Kong that we're currently living in. Yeah, I think one of the ingenious elements of the film is that it was funded by the PRC to be this supposedly pro PRC anti Vietnam piece of propaganda, but actually Anne Hui took that money and reversed that dynamic and made it into an anti PRC or anti dictatorship, anti totalitarianism statement. And like you said, back then when this movie was made, it was right during the negotiations for the Sino British Joint Declaration. So there was a lot of anxiety over Hong Kong's future and what the future Hong Kong would look like. So I think this movie, kind of regardless of the Vietnamese, Chinese background, you can really see a lot of those anxieties reflected in the movie itself.
Yeah, it happens in, the movement all the time. Maybe next week we can talk a little bit about Rouge. Like Rouge is
Hmm.
also in a very similar situation that it's about the 50 years one country two
Hmm.
system expectation and goals coming back to Hong Kong in 50 years and everything changes and all that. So it's all, in a sense, it's always some sort of allegory about Hong Kong's situation. And that's
Yeah.
what's attractive about this
It's
movement.
interesting you mentioned Rouge by director Stanley Guan Gampang, because Stanley Kwan is actually the assistant director of Boat People and kind of Anne Hu's apprentice, and then after Boat People and other films, as assistant director, he graduated to becoming director and made Nizikao, Rouge, and Center Stage Yuling Yok, many kind of very famous films of the Hong Kong second wave.
Yeah, so we can really see like a genealogy,
Yeah,
this kind of, allegorical thoughts.
Anne Hui herself, which we didn't mention, is also an apprentice of King Hui Wu Gumchun, who is also, one of Hong Kong cinema's most famous directors of martial arts cinema, wuxia cinema, and he has also earned great fame. So you can really see the kind of generation to generation lineage of Hong Kong cinema during that time. So back to Boat People. So Aubrey, what do you think about the political statement that Anne Hui is trying to make in this film? Like, what do you think it actually is?
Well, Anne Hui always gives me this idea, this impression that she is very much of a humanist and very
Hmm.
compassionate filmmaker. Sometimes people think that she's maybe a little bit melodramatic, and some people don't like both people also for the same reason that some tropes are maybe a little bit exaggerated. But whatever it is, Anne Hui always impresses me as a very humanistic filmmaker. She's interested in women, she's interested in the poor, the injured, the helpless, the old, the abused, things like that. So I guess if from a very literal standpoint, then this is what she wants to show, just the very difficult situation for the Vietnamese people whom she had contact with through her RTHK documentary and also the two films of her trilogy. You mentioned the story of Woo Viet, and also the other one was Boy from Vietnam from
Hmm.
1978. So yeah, she always, gives me this very compassionate idea of lives, men, women, children, all walks of life, regardless of their nationalities, and that's what makes her films warm to watch, but sometimes very heartbreaking as well.
Yeah, I think some of the criticisms against Boat People is that it's kind of too humanistic for its own good, that she cares,
Hmm.
so much about the little people on the ground that she kind of neglects the geopolitical forces that are behind the film. But I think in defense of her, you can actually see a lot of fingers being pointed at those people. I mean, at those, geopolitical countries and institutions. It's just kind of all hidden and it's not her primary concern, which I think is understandable for her as a filmmaker. It's not what she's really interested in. I feel like we can't really force her to make a statement about things that are not her primary concern. And I think, like, regarding what you said about the tropes, what I find very interesting about Bold People is that when people kind of criticize it as a piece of propaganda, you can really see how she kind of subverts the tropes of propaganda. For example, the Japanese photographer protagonist, who is supposed to be this kind of, neutral third country, war photographer, who is this kind of, like you expect him to be this peaceful visitor figure, kind of like the UN, a negotiator kind of role. And then he actually gets really involved, and he kind of has these tendencies to be really generous and rich. Like you see in the movie, he like literally offers financial assistance to the poor people that he meets. And then Anne Hui subverts this trope, which in US movies would be considered the white savior. Like Anne Hui subverts the white savior trope without, well, I don't really want to spoil what happens at the end of the movie, but let's just say that his white saviorship is subverted at the end, and it does not end in the way that we expect. The white savior in the movie does not come into Vietnam and solve all the problems and leave, and what you would expect from a kind of feel good narrative.
Yeah, it's definitely not a Hollywood narrative. Yeah, so it's a good point that it's anti like white savior. I would see that if some contemporary audience would still find the film kind of like problematic to watch today. For instance, to
Right.
play foreign characters, or I mean, the white savior character didn't end up the way a Hollywood film would want it to, but still, I mean, a pretty tragic ending of the character. So maybe from what I see that it's a very idealistic outlook for Anne Hui to put all these characters together, because obviously, if you remember one scene that George Lam's character is singing a Japanese children's
Mm-hmm.
song, and then Kam Lung is singing a Vietnamese children's song together
Mm.
when all things fell apart,
Right.
right? Her
Exactly.
mother died, her brothers died. So it is this, kind of like cross boundary solidarity of peoples that she's suggesting, right? It doesn't matter if it's Japanese or Vietnamese, we're all screwed. And eventually, and also George Lam's character is also, I mean, he's privileged, but his parents are also killed in the Second World War, right? So he's also a victim of war. So I guess it's a very idealistic story, I would say, to try to subvert the kind of national
Yeah,
boundary.
but I think at the same time, the kind of cross boundary solidarity that you said can be read as some kind of liberal fantasy. But I think what makes this film not that kind of liberal fantasy is specifically the tragic ending that you mentioned. Like, you expect this movie to be this kind of multinational globalism, everything is happy, look at all the children kind of movie, and then it actually does not end up being that. Because I think what strikes me most about Both People, like at a very visceral level, is that it is an extremely brutal film. It is actually the opposite of a feel good movie. It's actually one of the most brutal war films I've ever seen. When people think of brutal war films, they think of Hollywood films like Saving Private Ryan, which is like very graphic, violent. And Both People like isn't like that at all, but somehow manages to be so striking in this depiction of violence, because I think Anne Hui doesn't seek to make the violence and the bloodshed a spectacle. She just kind of shows it as this kind of everyday part of life of the Vietnamese people.
Mm-hmm.
And the kind of sudden bursts of violence are so striking and just so brutal, but it doesn't exploit, it
Yeah.
doesn't, it's not graphic, it's just, it really confronts you with the reality of war and the aftermath.
Right. It's like everyday business, right? Yeah, it's definitely a good point about violence that you're saying. I feel that she's giving us all of it. She's giving us love, and then she's giving us fear and shock and everything. You go in there and you are experiencing all of it, and it just stuns you. And I think the reason why she makes the why Savior character this way is because she intentionally doesn't want the audience to have this privileged position, because we actually see, I mean, the camera sees the story through George Lamb's perspective mostly, right? Because I mean, it's very figurative. He's a Japanese photojournalist, right? So he literally holds a camera, right, in the film, right, to hint us that we are also knowing the reality through the camera, right? So we are actually him. I mean, in a way, I mean, kind of like he's our virtual body. So she doesn't want us to, have this, feel good and, happy ending, right? She wants to impress us that, it's really not that, it's really sad what's happening in Vietnam.
How do you think the style of the movie is related to the Hong Kong New Wave? Like, kind of, what do you think are some of its outstanding stylistic elements?
I actually see very foreign influenced aesthetics. I'm not sure if I see like a close comparable in the same movement, but I definitely see foreign influence from French New Wave and other kind of like realist cinema,
Right.
like it maybe Italian realism or something, such as she uses a lot of low key lighting. Like the film is so hard to. I mean, it's so hard to know what's going on at some moments in the film, like because it's just too dark and like you don't really know what's going on. But that's exactly the point, right? That she doesn't want you to see everything. I mean, you're knowing the reality from a very privileged perspective, and you have to actually really make some efforts to know what's going on, right? And the color scheme was very bluish, very cold. So that's definitely about the tragedy, right? The war reality in
Yeah.
Vietnam. And also I see some maybe remnants of melodrama. Like the dialogue is very heavy. People keep talking and talking and talking. You literally, if you try to just like look away
And
and
the
just,
music too,
yeah,
right?
if you just hear the film without watching it, you will still pretty much know what's going on at all times. So it's a very heavy dialogue film. The characterization is very dramatic in a way. Like all the characters are very vibrant and specific. You have this officer Nguyen, who is a Vietnamese but French
Right.
educated, extremely
Right.
nostalgic, post-colonial officer, always thinking about French food and wine and the old days and being this young
Right.
revolutionary. And now he's completely disillusioned because he's old and he's forced to, work for the communists. And then he has a mistress, and the mistress is, beautiful, and
It's kind of like a
she
femme fatale.
yeah, and she knows how to like make French food, and she has American boyfriends and French boyfriends, and she has her means, but she also has to turn tricks for her lover, who's Tommy, played by
Andy
Andy
Lau.
Lau. So Tommy is this young man, right? He is every young man we saw in Hong Kong,
Mm.
right? To try to just get away, right? And then the composition is pretty standard, I would say. A rule of thirds type of composition, very mature, very well managed. She uses very strategized montage. You see
Right.
cows, and then you see young men in trucks, right? To mean that men are just like cattle in that situation, in trucks on their way to the new economic zone. So it's a completely dehumanizing, demoralizing situation,
Right.
right? And also like she sometimes uses fairly high contrast to shock you, such as the scene with the naked children in the new economic zone.
Yeah.
So you see, happy children at the beginning, right? They're singing and cute and happy and all well dressed, and then you see this,
Yeah.
high contrast evenings scene of children, and all of them are naked, and that's a
And
really
they're just like
haunting.
sleeping in a
I
barn.
know, that's so haunting. I mean, right? And of course, yeah, you saw also the graphic content. So it's very mature. I would say it's a very mature aesthetic that
Yeah.
she's showcasing. I can definitely see her education.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's interesting that you draw a comparison to French New Wave because I think one of the most interesting sequences or scenes of the film is kind of near the end when there is like a death of one of the characters, and it's kind of intercut in this very extreme way. Like she is dying and then it's intercut with like a funeral, and it's just extremely jarring, and the editing there is really really
Mm-hmm.
inspired.
Yeah, she's definitely deeply influenced by French New Wave. Like the naked children scene is that's like so much like Night and
Mm.
Frog. Remember? And actually later she makes a drama, right? But she also uses Night and Fog as the title. So, you can tell she probably was a fan of Pro Noir.
I think for me, stylistically, the opening shot is definitely a very, very striking kind of capital letters kind of shot, which is this very acrobatic 3 minute long take crane shot, which is like traveling up and down at the right at the end of the Vietnam War when the North Vietnam army is going into Da Nang, which is the city that both people was set in. And then she cuts from that extremely acrobatic long take to a short reverse shot on the ground between George Lamb, the
Hmm.
photographer, and his subject, which is a child who's lost his limb. And you can really kind of see the two sides of Ann Hui there, the side that is in the spectacle, the action, actually for a humanist filmmaker, she's made quite a lot of wartime spectacles throughout her career. She's even made wuxia films. And then on the other hand is the kind of humanist shot reverse shot, very realist, simplistic filmmaker. And in that 3 minutes, you really see the entire career of Anne Hui just in the opening of Boat People.
Yeah, actually, that sequence that you're talking about, that reminds me of Soviet Union, like a man with a moving
Mm-hmm.
camera type of like, different. You see, just go around the city and just look at the good and bad of the
Mm.
people, like snapshots, basically.
I think another thing that is stylistic about the film is kind of what I talked about in the brutality of the violence. I think Hollywood movies have this kind of puritanical fear of violence that is kind of like, like in PG-13 movies, you can't show blood, you can only show blood in R-rated movies. There's this kind of very Puritan thing where every drop of blood in American cinema is you have to look at and really, really decide if you want to put it there or not. And then both people, like a lot of Hong Kong films, back then and even now have this kind of indifference to violence that is very unflinching. It's just like children being blown apart. It's just part of the film, and then we move on to the next scene. Is you can see this in the story of Woo Viet, which is the previous film in her Vietnam trilogy, which is kind of about Chow Yun Fat before he became an action star, and then he's doing these kind of action scenes at the second half of the movie. And again, the violence is just kind of very straight to the point, very unflinching. It just happens, and it's very kind of there's no fear of blood at all. It's just the blood is just splattering across the screen. And this is by Anne Hui, who is not a genre filmmaker, who is not a filmmaker we associate with heroic bloodshed. And then you can also kind of see this unflinching attitude towards violence in, so-called more romantic filmmakers like Wong Kar-wai, etc. So you can really see this attitude towards violence in Hong Kong cinema that is very, very different from Hollywood cinema that we might be used to. And I think both people, even though it's kind of this humanist drama, has a lot of these elements as well.
Yeah, I agree. Very honest and authentic and poetic type
Mm-hmm.
of violence. Kind of a trademark violence, isn't it? I mean, we're experts of violence. Look at the martial arts
Mm-hmm.
films in the 60s, right? I mean, even if we're, like poetic people, I think all Hong Kong fans has a taste of, the kind of like bloody
Yeah.
tradition of violence as aesthetic. So
Right.
very good. Awesome. So, well, I'm so looking forward to Love
Mhm.
After Love. Justin, do you know how we can get tickets to
So
watch
I
that?
believe
Is
it
it
is
free or do we
free.
have to pay
So you
for
can
it
go
or how
to
does that work?
cinema.usc.edu, and then under the events page, you can go to the event page for Love After Love screening on July 6th. And then you can just RSVP there, and it is a free screening to the public in Los Angeles. And on the next episode, we will talk more about Anne Hui's kind of mid-career period where she made movies like Song of the Exile, right? And then we're going to wrap up her career in the current decade and kind of what she's been up to. You can reach out to us or Hong Kong on Screen through our Hong Kong on Screen Facebook page or Instagram.
So leave a comment if you want us to focus on a particular film that you like.
I would also like to add that Boat People is one of Ann Hui's most accessible films in the West. It is currently available on the Criterion channel, and it also has a fantastic Blu-ray release just released this year by Criterion. It has Boat People and also has 2 more documentaries about Ann Hui, both feature length. So in that Blu-ray, you really get 3 features. This being one of Ann Hui's most accessible movies in the West, it's definitely one of the easiest to check out, and we really encourage you to check it out. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Yay! Bye.
Bye.